Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north in the direction of Terny, where there are developments both to the northeast of the village as well as to the southeast of Yampolivka. The Russians have managed to advance in the northern parts of Terny towards the outskirts of the village by capturing the final parts of the forest line in the northeastern section. This follows a Ukrainian counterattack to the south, which allowed the Ukrainians to recapture and push back the Russians a certain section from the front line, push them away from the village. Following this developments, the Russians started to relocate some of their forces to the north, where fighting is now taking place over the final forest area here to the northeast of Terny. If the Russians push through in the next coming weeks like they've done to the southeast and east of Terny, it is likely that the Russians will continue to push here in the northern direction to attempt to gain closer to Terny and expand the front line. During this reallocation of Russian troops to the north, the Ukrainians did a response by sending forces to the south, where east of Yampolivka the Russians have been pushed back to the outskirts of the forest line here to the east of Yampolivka. This gives a good advantage to the Ukrainians in the area to allow them to try and completely push out the Russians from the forest areas, which would complicate further Russian offensive operations near Yampolivka. We've seen throughout the past few weeks and months that in the section of the front line northwest of Kmina, the Russians have simply been pushing westwards from one section to another, slowly moving further and further north, where they now are at the borders of both the villages of Terny, Yampolivka, and Torske/Serishne. All of these four villages are villages where the Russians are very close to. If the Russians push through the forest area to the north as well, they'll be close to Novosadova as well. With all of this, we see that it is possible that the Russians are now able to launch a larger scale offensive operation with armored assaults to gain control of the eastern bank of the Serebet river line. With this, we see that as soon as the Russians start their offensive operations, however, waiting that long to gain control over the eastern bank of the Serebet river is detrimental to the Russian tactics, as that would mean that the Russians would look to gain control of the eastern bank of the Serebet river line. In the time it takes for the Russians to gain control over the territories east of the river line, the Ukrainians would be able to relocate its forces to defend the river line. Instead, it would be more sensible to take control over the east of the river line before launching the offensive operations, so that the focus can go towards the southern parts by Serishne and Torske and launch an operation towards Liman, and following that take control of the east of the Serebet river line to divert the forces into two groups, where the biggest group would be the one fighting towards Liman instead of going over the river line. Moving further south here in the direction of the north of Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern parts of Novokalinove, advancing further within the village, gaining control over one of the streets up to the forest patch. With this, the eastern road has been cut off by the Russians. The Ukrainians will not be able to use it with the Russian presence within the forest area, as that will allow direct fire from any sort of weapons from the forest patch as well as behind by the village itself. With this, we see that the fighting will now be allocated and focused around the western parts, where the Russians will look to gain control over the fortifications here in between Otina and Novokalinove. In the direction of Otina itself, the Russians are here fighting over the southern parts where the gray zone has expanded, but there's been no confirmation of further runs and advancements within the village itself. But based on this information, we see that the direction of Otina, the fortifications in between that and Novokalinove, as well as the eastern parts of Novokalinove, is seeing intense fighting by the Russians as they storm through the villages and fortifications in the northern section of the front line. The Russians have completely bypassed Bahmut and gone straight for Oshirotine, where according to the latest reports, the Russians gained a foothold, then they went to hold their positions instead of fighting further, but while carrying out a rotation where additional troops were coming to Oshirotine before they restarted offensive operations to fight over the southern parts of the village. If the Russians manage to gain control over the southern parts, then they can move on to the central parts and cross over the railway to then push towards the Ukrainian fortifications to the northeast of Oshirotine and move through the area, which consists of mainly larger buildings with bigger gaps in between the areas. Dacha area here to the east of the village, and schools, high-rise buildings, etc. here in the northeastern parts. This is the tougher area to fight through, while in the southern and central parts it's mainly residential areas, where there is this industrial-ish area here to the northwest of Otina, which is likely connected with the railway station, allowing them to have some industry going thanks to the railway stop in the area. So with this we see that there is consistent attacks by the Russians in the northern section, where the main fighting has relocated following the end of the Battle of Berdishi and the near-end Battle of Semenivka, where fighting also continues here to the south, where the Russians have now gained a foothold within Nitelova after capturing Pervomaiske, and the fighting here to the south of Pervomaiske has also intensified as the Russians are looking to close this pocket here in the south of Pervomaiske, north of Nevelske. It is reported by the Russian sources that the Ukrainians have been completely pushed out of the area, and coming operations are underway by the Russians, where they're trying to make sure that it is completely clear of any Ukrainian forces. This is to connect the front line with Nevelske from Pervomaiske to the north. It is a slow operation by the Russians, as they're doing it very safely, making sure that the area is not completely mined and booby-trapped by the Ukrainians that withdrew from the area under fire of the Russian forces. But if we do see a Russian control of the area the next coming days, we may see the start of a Russian operation in 3 different directions. The main direction would be here towards Nitelova to gain control over the village. Then there would be one pushing towards Karolivka, here in the northwestern direction from Nevelske, and finally a push towards Krasnodarivka from the north. This would be to cut off the final supply route in and out of Krasnodarivka. There are 3 separate supply routes in and out of Krasnodarivka. From the south by Marinka towards Krasnodarivka, which the Russians have full control of. There's the railways to the west of Krasnodarivka, which the Russians are fighting over here to the south of the city. And then there's this road here to the north, connected by Krasnodarivka through Zelane Pershe here to the northwest. If the Russians gain control of that, then Krasnodarivka would be completely cut off from any supply routes in and out of the city. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will focus their operations by coming the pocket here to the northeast of Nevelske before pushing down southwest of Nevelske towards Krasnodarivka, cutting off the supply route and significantly strengthening their offensive operations towards the city. Moving further south here in the direction of Novomikhailivka to the southwest of that, west of Slutke, there's been a small Russian advance in this direction, where the Russians are pushing towards the main road here to the north of Volodar. This is in connection with the near end of the Battle of Novomikhailivka, where the fighting is mainly taking place in the western parts of the town, as the Russians continuously push through the Ukrainian defenses and are starting to get near the fighting over Konstantinivka. If the Russians start fighting over Konstantinivka here to the west of Novomikhailivka, the fighting will continue towards the main road here west of Solotke to cut off the supplies to Volodar completely before offensive operations restart in that direction. Moving back north to the west of Bahmut, we see here in this section of the front line, the Russians are continuously fighting over Jesev Yar, where the Russian Air Force is providing with Su-25 close air support planes, providing close air support towards Jesev Yar. These planes providing close air support, as is shown in this video here, shows that the Russian Air Force has complete air superiority in this section of the front line. Allowing them to fly so close without being shot down is a significant development in this war, as Ukraine has had a significant air defense since the very start of the war. However, it has now been so heavily attrited that it is hard to say that they have much of an air defense left. This is why Ukraine is asking for 7 whole Patriot missile systems. That is a very significant number of air defense systems. Japan, even of itself, only has 7 Patriot systems. So we see that the Ukrainians are asking for a significant amount of air defense, and the main reason for that is the majority of the Ukrainian air defense is either completely out of ammunition or has been destroyed. And this allows the Russian Air Force to fly near the front line, and this heavily complicates the situation for the Ukrainian soldiers fighting by the front line. Finally, there is this CNN article where the CIA director warns Ukraine could lose the war completely this year if the United States does not send more aid. According to him, the Ukrainians could lose the war. Previously, he warned that they could lose significant territories. Now he says he has upgraded it to completely losing the war. And this is by 2024. Not into 2025, but by the end of the year. The switch about how the situation has probably significantly worsened since last month, where the Ukraine is likely to lose ground and probably significant ground in 2024, has turned into a complete loss, is likely due to the fact that over the past this past month, Ukraine has attempted to delay the Russian forces as much as possible, while at the same time trying to hold the line, which they have been able to for the most part. However, the Russians have nonetheless captured about 50 square kilometers of territory throughout this past month, which raises the question: if the Ukrainians are sending the majority of their reserve forces to the front to hold the line, yet are still being pushed back, then exactly how many casualties are the Ukrainians taking? How much of their reserve forces have they committed? And what is the current situation? It is clear based on the information that we received from open sources, the Russians have a significant firepower advantage, about 10-1 when it comes to artillery itself. On top of that, the Russians have a complete air superiority, as is shown with the video of close air support near Chasiv Yar. So there is a significant change near the front where the Russians are just continuously growing in power in comparison to the Ukrainians' capabilities. This means that if the Russians continue as is and the Ukrainians do not receive additional aid, then the Ukrainians will eventually lead to a collapse of their armed forces. And this is why it has turned from significantly losing ground to a complete defeat, because the situation just continues to deteriorate. Over the past months, it has gone from, if the Ukrainian armed forces collapses, at least they'll be able to withdraw to the Dnieper River, hold half the country. It has now turned into, well, the Ukrainians could completely lose because they do not even have the capabilities to hold the Dnieper River. However, the details are not clear. In the end, time will tell. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content, and have a great day.